Welcome to Aging Insight with your host, John Ross and Lisa Scholmeyer. This program is made possible by
Welcome to Aging Insight. I'm Lisa Scholmeyer. I'm here with John Ross, and we're so glad to be back with you to share some information with you about the retirement years and aging right here in our community, because we want to make sure that you have the information and the tips that you need to make it as enjoyable as possible. So, John, here we are again.
That's right, and welcome to all of y'all. You know, we know at Aging Insight that you're going to need information as you get older and you start trying to navigate through your health, your housing, your financial, and your legal needs, and all of these things come crashing together along with a maze of all kinds of rules and regulations, and we try to make sure you've got the right information to do that. You know, we often talk about on the program that people want to protect themselves and protect their assets. And oftentimes when people think about protecting themselves or protecting their assets, they're thinking about protecting them, say, from the devastating cost of long-term care.
That's one area they think about.
Perhaps maybe from litigation, lawsuits, things like that. Protecting them from taxes, big one.
Protecting from maybe family members who are trying to take advantage.
Yeah, fraud and scams and things like that. But oftentimes, the person that you really need to protect yourself from is somebody unexpected.
That's right. The most, where we see the most devastation in people's retirements and the assets that they have collected for themselves and intended to live out the rest of their life, the very number one source of devastation is you, the person themselves.
That's right. Sometimes it can, one of the hardest things in our practice is protecting you from yourself. You know, oftentimes when we start visiting with folks, we see them as they progress through their later years and they fall into a time frame that in our practice we call frail, vulnerable, but not yet incompetent. Or maybe they are slowly getting there, but in any case, they're now having, between the problems that they're having with their physical health or the problems they're having with their mental health, oftentimes that person changes. The person you are changes. You may not necessarily realize that what you're doing is not you. You know, it's kind of like Lisa, you know, a crazy person never thinks they're crazy.
Right, they think everyone else is.
They think everyone else is. And while we can joke about that sometimes, it's a reality, especially when you start talking about things like Alzheimer's or some of the other dementias that are out there, even just your age-based dementias that come on in those later years. The person you are today is not necessarily the person you are then.
That's right. And we've seen this come about in a lot of different ways. You know, oftentimes we are visiting such with a married couple and maybe they've been married for 40 plus years and they're making an estate plan and they want to take care of each other and then they want that legacy to pass on to their children and grandchildren. And, you know, that plan looks marvelous, but oftentimes we will visit with a widow or widower from that same couple a few years down the road, and they have invited another companion into their lives. They have maybe gotten some new hobbies and some new friends they didn't have before, and they're engaging in some activities and spending their money in ways they never would have done so earlier in their retirement years. And so we see that kind of change from time to time. And you know, when we bring that up with that younger retiree married couple, when they're in our office and we bring up, well, okay, what happens, you know, what are your intentions? You know, if something happens to one of you, do we need to make some provisions here so that we can have these assets set aside for you? Most often the reaction is they just laugh and say, oh, my husband, my wife would never do any of these other things that would impact our children later, and they just don't take it very seriously. And the people they are right there sitting in front of us, they would never do those things. But a few years later, if they've experienced some changes in their personality due to their own conditions, the bank account's empty and the legacy is gone, and it's nothing we can do at that point.
That's right. So we have this, at least from our standpoint in our practice, we have this very difficult counterbalancing act to try to figure out. And that is, on the one hand, we want somebody, all of us, we want to be free to do whatever we want. And that includes making dumb decisions.
Right.
If I want to take all of my money and go to the casinos and gamble it, as long as I understand the consequences of all of that, is it a smart decision? No. Is it my decision though, and am I free to make it? Of course. On the other hand, if I'm giving all of my money away to somebody because they're promising things that the sane me would have never believed, maybe they've tricked me into that they're my best friend in the whole world, and they've convinced me that all of my kids hate me, and yet my frail mental capacity allows me to believe in that, and I can't remember because of my Alzheimer's maybe the last time my kids came. So far as I know, they haven't come and seen me, and next thing I know, I'm being manipulated. And yet, in that point, I don't need to be making those decisions for myself any longer. But figuring out when that time comes, because unfortunately, by the time you're already there, it's too late. Because you've already done things that have created these problems. So we're going to try to give you some solutions to these problems and some things that you might think about when you're doing your own planning. Again, the idea is, how do you protect yourself from yourself?
Right. So stick around after the break and we'll talk about some tools and some methods that we can use to help you do that.
The Wadley Senior Clinic has been such a blessing for our family. Because they specialize in geriatric care, they take the time to really focus on Dad's needs. Their exam rooms are specially designed for seniors, and they offer lab and x-ray on site. With monthly educational programs on health and wellness of the mind and body, our healthcare questions get answered. Best of all, they accept Dad's Medicare benefits. See what the Wadley Senior Clinic can do for you. Wadley Senior Clinic, where healthy relationships begin.
Hi there, I'm Larry Sims. It's been my privilege for the past several years to be a volunteer board member of Hospice of Texarkana, and there I'm able to represent community members like you. We continually customize our end-of-life care to better meet the needs of our community. As an example, our medical director and nurse practitioners still make visits to homes and facilities. Call today to learn more about the help we can give your family. Hospice of Texarkana, the nonprofit hospice established in 1985 for the community, by the community.
Welcome back to Aging Insight, everybody. I'm your host, John Ross, here with Lisa Scholmeyer, my co-host. And today we're talking about probably one of the most difficult parts of our practice, and that is how to protect somebody from themselves. Because as you age, as your mental faculties decline, it becomes more and more difficult for you to make rational, well-reasoned decisions. And unfortunately, there's a time where you're clearly incapable of making your own decisions. There's a time where you're clearly capable, and you're capable and incapable. And these two are very clear, but all of this range in between is not so clear. And the problem is if you haven't figured out what to do in all of this, during that transition from competent to incompetent, you will get taken advantage of, or you can. And often this can be by close people, they can be by family members, it can be by people who are professing their love to you. There's lots of different places. So that's what we're going to try to solve today for you.
Yeah, John, I wanted to talk about a fact situation that went all the way to the Arkansas Court of Appeals. And in that case, we had a gentleman who had lost his wife, but he and his wife had set up an estate plan that included a trust. And the trust provided that after the death of the first of them, then the survivor remained as the trustee, and all assets in that trust were completely available for the support and health needs of the surviving spouse. And that is a very common type provision. Unfortunately, though, that surviving spouse, in the last year of his life, he changed the beneficiaries of his trust to a live-in caregiver that had come into his life, and he even made her a trustee of the trust. And so by the time the gentleman passed away, there were no assets left in the trust, and any of the other assets that were around that were funded into the trust at his death, his children were not the beneficiaries as he and his wife had originally set up. So he had that complete autonomy that, as a competent person, was not a problem, but as he became more frail and more subject to the influence of someone else, he made drastic changes that legally he could make that really devastated his family. In this case, the kids sued the live-in caregiver. It went all the way to the Arkansas Supreme Court. And the Arkansas Supreme Court said that under that trust, that gentleman had been free to make those changes, and there was nothing that the kids could do about it. So John, when I met with one of these adult children, this was in the aftermath. One of their questions was, what could have been done differently to prevent Dad? And they weren't just looking about their inheritance. They were just concerned. They had been isolated from their dad in that last year of life. The caregiver wouldn't let them come around. And they had asked me what could have been done differently to prevent that situation.
Right, and from the outset, the problem they had here was, again, it was all that autonomy that Dad had following it. And when I say that this is a hard situation to solve, it is.
Yes.
But I can give you some examples of some ways that I have seen people try to solve this. For example, I had I executed a trust recently for a husband and wife, and they have provided that after one of them passes away, everything is still available to the surviving spouse, can be used, every penny of it can be used for her. But instead of that surviving spouse being the sole trustee, at that point, the surviving spouse and their two kids are all co-trustees. And the way it provides is that the three of them have to act together. And they can't change the terms without all three of them. They can't make major disbursements without all three of them. And so, in their case, they have a very good relationship with their children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
which works well and right now. But just as easily, that sort of thing could go wrong.
Well, right, because in a situation like that, that certainly does help protect that senior from doing something to themselves. The kids have to be involved. But, what happens if we're dealing with a trust or an estate plan where we have stepchildren involved? That surviving spouse is probably not going to be too keen on the idea of having their stepchildren also as a trustee on their trust and having to look at every expenditure that's coming out of that trust.
Right. So again, that may be an appropriate solution for one person, an inappropriate solution for somebody else. Yeah. Their other options are to not have the, to make the trust irrevocable when the first, most of these type of trusts can be changed or amended over time. But even with with a revocable trust, you can say, for example, that husband and wife are creating this revocable trust, and that as long as they're both alive, they can change or amend it at any time. But then when one of them passes, it becomes irrevocable, meaning that that spouse can no longer change the terms of it. Now, unfortunately, there's also a backdoor out of this, because if that spouse has unlimited use of the funds, then all they have to do is take it out of the trust. They can't change the trust, but they can always just empty it. And so there are, even with that though, so first of all, you can make it where they cannot change the terms of the trust, at least not without a written agreement of all the other beneficiaries, for example, like the stepkids and things like that. The other thing is you can add in some other parties to this. For example, you can have what's called a distribution advisor. And this would be somebody that has the authority to veto large distributions or distributions over a certain amount. So in other words, the spouse has the freedom to use the assets for their basic needs, but if they were going to make a large distribution of those assets over, say, some certain amount, that would have to require the approval of some third party, maybe a CPA or a financial advisor or a trusted friend who's got no dog in this fight. You know, not necessarily the kids, but still a trusted professional.
Right, and so you can see where the difficulty is here, because you know, these are assets that you've accumulated and worked for a lifetime, and you know, you want to be able to do with them what you want, and it's very difficult to find that just the right balance between that independence versus being very restrictive. And so far, we just don't have a super solution for every situation that strikes that right balance.
Yeah,
So,
the beauty of being free is that you can do with your stuff whatever you want. But the downside of having very strong freedom protections is that when you're trying to reduce your own freedoms, essentially, the other question is trying to figure out when to have these provisions kick in and take effect and things like that. And that's a whole nother category. So we're going to take another quick break. And when we come back, we'll keep talking about how to protect yourself from yourself.
Hi there, I'm Larry Sims. It's been my privilege for the past several years to be a volunteer board member of Hospice of Texarkana, and there I'm able to represent community members like you. We continually customize our end-of-life care to better meet the needs of our community. As an example, our medical director and nurse practitioner still make visits to homes and facilities. Call today to learn more about the help we can give your family. Hospice of Texarkana, the nonprofit hospice established in 1985 for the community, by the community.
I'm so glad we found the Wadley Senior Clinic. Their team specializes in caring for older adults, and their doctors listen and work with me to keep me healthy and independent. With monthly educational programs, x-ray and lab, and state-of-the-art exam rooms, I get expert care and understanding about what I'm going through. Best yet, they're easy to get to right off the interstate at Jefferson. See what Wadley Senior Clinic could do for you. Wadley Senior Clinic, where healthy relationships begin.
welcome back to Aging Insight. I'm Lisa Scholmeyer here with John Ross, and today we're talking about a very difficult subject of how to protect yourself from yourself. And you know, John, it's always the case when we talk about this with clients, you know, when they're planning their estates, they just sort of laugh this off.
Sure.
A lot of times, saying, "Oh, I would never, ever, you know, do some of those activities that you've just told me about." But yet, how many times?
Right. And it's not them that's doing it.
Right.
And that's what the people don't realize, is it's not you that's doing these things. It's the disease
It's the new you.
that has inhabited your body and is changing the fundamental person that you are, presumably.
Yeah.
Because we have had plenty of folks who were one way their whole life. And then later on, in those later years, they did become a new person, not necessarily because they were incapacitated in any way, but because they had gotten to a point in life where they said, you know what, I'm not living up to those standards anymore. I'm going to do what I want to do. And that's okay too. Even if that's a little wild and maybe a little different, but finding the balance of this is very difficult.
Yeah. So, we talked a minute ago about what's the timing of trying to put in some of these protections. A lot of couples we talk with, they often focus on that time after the death of one of them. And so they look at that time as being a place where maybe some additional, assurances could be put in place. But what are the difficulties with using that point in time where a spouse has died and has left that widow or widower? What are the difficulties about suddenly that person, not only have they lost their spouse, but now they're dealing with co-trustees on a trust on their own assets that they've managed their whole married life together. So that can just add stress to the situation. So, but that is a definitive point in time that we can use to put in some of those protections.
Yeah, and there's not a right or wrong here. Now, certainly, if you've been given a diagnosis, if you've had some, say, initial memory loss or something to that effect, and you've gone to the doctor and the doctor says, well, this looks like perhaps the first stages of Alzheimer's. That is the time to get everything in order, right then. It's not 6 months from then, it's not a year from then, it's right that very second while you still have the ability to think these things through, because when you start talking about something like Alzheimer's, paranoia is a big piece of it, and things that you would have thought were okay you just may not be able to think that clearly. So certainly if you have a diagnosis, but even then it can be very difficult to figure out, if you don't have a diagnosis, or if you're a single person, so there's not a spousal trigger in all of this. At some point in time, you've got to decide where and when is the best place for you. So for example, it's not uncommon for us to see where maybe somebody, as they're getting older, and this could be a single person or even a married couple, where, again, typically using something like a trust, at some point in time, while they're still perfectly capable of doing it themselves, they will bring in a financial institution like a bank. Now, they may not necessarily make the bank a trustee. So in other words, they're still in charge, but they have done what's called an agency agreement. And this is where they have assigned their duties as trustee to that bank. So the bank is now making sure their bills are getting paid on time each month, and they're funneling a little money from one account over into, for example, the checking account, where the single senior adult or the married couple, they don't really notice. They're still going to the bank, they're still going to the grocery store and swiping their debit card and writing checks. And as that account gets a little bit low, the bank just automatically moves some money over there for them. But with this sort of arrangement, the bank is then kind of keeping an eye on everything that is going on, and can notice large withdrawals or that bank balance getting empty too quickly, and can kind of get in there and figure out what's going on. And if you have that sort of arrangement set up in advance, it's a lot of times you can also then build in some triggers that if the bank starts seeing things going on, who can the bank notify? For example, other family members or trusted professionals who are out there who are helping out, and those folks can then step in and maybe convert that to an irrevocable trust, or get a doctor's letter saying that you're no longer competent to be the trustee, and maybe the trust document says at that point then you're no longer the trustee. So having that third party in there, even though you're not necessarily making them the trustee, you've got this third party who's intimately involved with the inner workings of the trust, and that way they know when you start doing something weird.
Right, and the thing I like about the agency agreements with the banks is, there's no dog in the fight concept.
Right.
It's not one of your kids over another. It's not, a close friend or family member who may have interest down the road. This is just a professional banker who is monitoring for normalcy, and that's all.
That's right. And often the fees associated with having the bank in their capacity as an agent for you, as opposed to being a full-blown trustee, the fees are usually lower. So you can retain your control, and yet you've kind of got this third party in the background that's keeping an eye on everything. And so that can be a good way of doing it.
Well, John, you just said a word that scares a lot of our seniors when you say fees.
That's right.
But I could think of so many situations where a little bit of fees to the bank in an agency situation would have saved tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars for some of our clients.
There's a fee either way.
Right.
The bank is honest enough to tell you what that fee is. The caregiver, child, whoever it is that comes in and robs you blind, they don't tell you what their fee is. So, well, once again, you've reached the end of another edition of Aging Insight. Hope you picked up a few little tidbits. Of course, if you always need more information, you can listen to us live every Saturday at noon on 98.5. That's Aging Insight Radio, where you can call in and ask questions. You can go on the internet and you can go to aginginsight.com, where you can find past episodes of this program and past episodes of the radio show. And you can also, even from that website, you can pick up a digital copy of the Aging Insight magazine. Or, if you like, you can swing by maybe your local doctor's office, hospital, or even come by our office, and we'll be more than happy to give you as many as you can carry. So we thank you, and we hope you get lots of good information from us. Otherwise, we'll be back around next week.
All right. See you then.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this week's Aging Insight program with John Ross and Lisa Scholmeyer. This program is made possible by